you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. I'll make sure to make breaks, but please just jump ahead with questions at any time because I might not have guessed where the right moments for breaks are. More importantly, this is joint work with Vasiliki Skreta, and you'll see this is like a small attempt to write an IO theory paper. So in this paper, we want to think about consumer data in the form of their purchase histories. And this is data that is both available to firms. Indeed, you can find after the talk where Gmail has kept a very tidy list of all the purchases you've made online. And perhaps you want to delete that because this data sometimes is used for personalized pricing. And even though we think that this is something that happens in our big data digital economy, this idea that the purchase history is used to for personalized pricing is not limited to online settings. Think about the case where you purchase a car, then you have to show up to the insurance company, and the fact that you bought a Tesla Model 3 versus a Tesla Model S might give the insurance company some information about your willingness to purchase for insurance above and beyond the value of the car. Now, before I go too much anti-firm on this, we should also remember that firms also use consumer data to customize the products that consumers get. And indeed, this trade-off between using consumer data for product customization and using it for personalized pricing is sort of at the heart of the policy debate on big data. So, for instance, this White House report on big data and differential pricing that I think economists are sort of aware of says versioning has the benefit of reducing concerns about inequity that arise with personalized pricing, and big data might facilitate versioning strategies based on mass customization. And even practitioners talk about it this way. There's a positive side to all the tracking companies do too. It allows them to customize offers. So in this paper, we want to make I would say perhaps a small point, but shed new light on this debate by emphasizing that the data that we're talking about here, which is the data that comes from purchase histories, is endogenously generated. It is gleaned from past interactions between consumers and firms. And in particular, there's two ways in which the data available to firms is endogenous. The first is that the trade-off that we know from the literature on behavior-based price discrimination, which is that given a choice set, the data will be selected because the consumer will make choices trading off getting a better match against the threat of price discrimination. But the second way in which this data is endogenous, and I think that this is what people have explored less, is that the choices that the consumer selects from is designed by a firm, cognizant of the environment in which the consumer is making choices. And it is precisely the richness of the firm's product line which determines the richness of the data available about the consumer to others, and therefore it determines the possibilities to price discriminate the consumer in the future. So in this paper, basically what we want to understand is how does the availability of consumer data in the form of purchase histories shape the product offerings that firms make to consumers. And we're going to study this in a very stylized model of upstream-downstream interaction. I will say upstream and downstream, not because we are going to have an input supplier and a retailer, but just to not be saying period 1 and period 2 all the time. So the upstream firm will choose a quality range with quadratic cost. So this will be like the basic case of Mosa Rosen. And X1 will be the payment from the consumer to the firm, and the consumer will have private information about her valuation for quality, and utilities will be linear in the valuation for quality and money. After purchasing the good from the upstream firm, the consumer has the option of interacting with the downstream firm, which will be producing an indivisible good at zero marginal cost. So in the second period, the downstream firm is just deciding between allocating the good to the consumer or not allocating the good, and we're going to assume that the consumer has either low valuation or high valuation for the good, but again utilities are linear in the probability that the good is allocated and money. Now, what is the connection between the two periods is that valuations are going to be positively correlated. So we're going to assume that a consumer of type theta has value VH with some probability P theta that will be increasing in theta. So someone that values quality higher is more likely to also value the indivisible good higher. So you can think of the rationale for why the model is set up is you can think of the upstream period as the period where information about the consumer is useful for productive reasons, whereas in the second period, there's no role for the information about theta except for price discrimination. So the information about theta is not relevant for any productive reasons, except that the firm might want to use this information to price discriminate the consumer. So basically, if we think about the across periods allocations, the utility of the consumer is just a expected utility from the two periods. There's no discounting in this model. So we're going to have the utility from the purchase of the good of variable quality with some probability the consumer is of high value, with the remaining probability she will be of low value in the second period. The downstream firm will maximize revenue because it has zero marginal costs. And the upstream profits, we're going to assume that the firm is going to maximize a combination of the profits from the product of variable quality and some percentage of the downstream profits. So for now, I will have a slide later on where I give more interpretation about the firm's payoffs, but for now, you can think of like two extreme situations. You could think of gamma equals 1, and the upstream firm and the downstream firm are exactly the same firm that are interacting repeatedly with the consumer. Or you could think gamma equals 0. There's someone sells a car and someone else sells insurance, and basically the downstream firm will be some sort of externality on the upstream firm, even though the upstream firm doesn't care directly about the downstream profits. But I will explain a little bit. I will spend more time on the firm's payoffs later. So we're going to follow a mechanism design approach, and the consumer will face therefore a sequence of mechanisms. Upstream, there's going to be an upstream and downstream mechanism, and the timing will be as follows. The consumer will first learn her type, her evaluation for quality, faces the upstream mechanism. As a consequence of this, some choice out of the mechanism will be determined, or maybe the consumer rejects. Then the consumer will observe her value for the second period good, and then she will face the downstream mechanism. And the reason we're following a mechanism design approach is that we want to avoid, we know that in IO there's results that are driven by restrictions on the firm's choices, like for instance, whether vertical integration reduces externality, allows firms to internalize the inefficiency in pricing. That could be resolved without vertical integration, but by giving the upstream firm a larger set of choices. So we don't want that any of the distortions that we identify come from restrictions on the choices of the firms, but rather on the strategic considerations in the economy. Now we're going to look at three scenarios. The first one that we're going to call vertical integration is one where in the period 1, the upstream firm will choose both the product line and the downstream allocation. So basically, the upstream firm will be able to internalize the informational externalities across periods. So whatever distortions we observe in this case will come from the need to leave rents to the consumer due to her private information. The second scenario is going to be called data intermediation. And here we're going to allow the upstream firm to choose both the product line and also the downstream information. So the upstream firm will be the only source of access to consumer information that the downstream firm has. And the downstream firm, whatever information she receives, will choose her downstream mechanism optimally given this information. In the third scenario that we're going to call limited commitment because of our previous work, the upstream firm will choose the product line. It might choose what additional information the downstream firm has available, but very importantly, the downstream firm will always have access to the consumer's purchase history. So in the difference between data intermediation and limited commitment is that there's one piece of information, which is what product the consumer purchased in the first period, that is always available to the downstream firm. And this would be reasonable both in this online world where GML is publishing our purchase histories, but also if the firm is the same firm interacting across periods with the consumer, the firm won't forget the consumer's choice out of the mechanism. So the comparison between the two first scenarios will allow us to capture the frictions that are introduced by the fact that the downstream firm chooses the mechanism optimally given the downstream information. And the comparison between scenarios 2 and 3 will allow us to capture on top of that the distortions that come from the availability of the purchase histories. And most of the action for us will be happening in the third scenario. And in fact, what we will show is that the availability of the purchase histories will lead to a narrower product line than in the case in which the firm has control over both the product line and the downstream allocation. And the intuition is relatively simple. By curtailing the quality range, the upstream firm provides the consumer less opportunities to self-select, and therefore makes it whatever information the downstream firm has about the consumer less informative about the consumer's type. And this softens price discrimination downstream, and therefore softens the ratchet effect in the first period, because the consumer will be demanding rents from the upstream firm whenever the rich product line leads to price discrimination. So basically, we will be working towards pictures that look like this throughout the talk. So where I'm mapping what each consumer type in the first period gets in terms of quality. Because we're looking at linear quadratic Musa-Rosen, in the first best, the consumer should get a quality that's proportional to her type over the parameter of the cost function. And in the second best, which will be exactly the product line that we will get in the vertical integration scenario, we will see that there's downward distortion. So each consumer type will get a quality less than that you will get in the first best. But if you compare the product lines, they will be exactly the same. So the way Musa-Rosen introduced the adverse selection introduces distortions in the Musa-Rosen world is that each quality becomes more expensive to purchase, but the firm is providing the consumer actually the same product line as in the first best. But with limited commitment, what we're going to get is product lines that look like this. And I will show you how the shape of the product line changes with the parameters of the model. But very importantly, there will be products that will be removed from the vertical integration product line that will force some consumers to pull. And this pooling will then obfuscate information for the downstream firm, and therefore the downstream firm will be less able to price discriminate. And because we have a model where we have positive correlation between consumers' values and types across periods, we're going to get that when there is price discrimination, it will happen for the consumers that buy at the very top of the product line. So you might wonder what happens then with data intermediation. So when you can choose what information to provide to the downstream firm, we will show that it will solve product line distortions. So the upstream firm actually will offer the consumer full privacy and a complete product line, the same as in the vertical integration situation. But as I will show you, this will have ambiguous welfare effects. And this is something that you can already see in this picture. Some consumers in the limited commitment solution will get higher quality than what they were getting before, and some consumers will get lower quality. And depending on the range of upward and downward distortions, we're going to have that sometimes the consumer actually prefers the limited commitment situation, so that when the firm offers full privacy, it will hurt the consumer. And finally, underlying what we are doing here, if you're not very interested in product line design, basically what's going to allow us to characterize a firm's optimal mechanism will be an extension of our revelation principle for mechanism design with limited commitment, which originally was proved for fully persistent types, to the case in which the consumer's type evolves over time according to a Markov first order Markov process. Maybe this is a good time to pause and ask questions before I go into the related literature. All good? All right. So we're, of course, building on, as usual, on a very rich literature. So the idea that purchase histories are informative about consumers' choices and that this might be used for price discrimination, this goes back to the literature on behavior-based price discrimination. But what we're adding to this literature is this idea that, so in that literature, basically the firm is only setting prices. So when the consumer rejects a particular price, you're only learning whether the consumer's valuation is above or below a price. But when you're offering a product line, you have other ways in which to shape the data that is available about the consumer. So in a sense, you have a way to control the richness of the data available for price discrimination. There's a big literature that studies product line design and especially multi-product competition. So actually the term that we're using, product line pruning, comes from this series of papers by Johnson and Maya, to where they are showing how when firms compete in the same product space, that might introduce coarser product lines. And the reason is that, so think of a firm that produces a complete product line and a new firm enters the market. You might want to remove products from your product line to soften competition with the new firm. So always in a product line, we have self-cannibalization. If you have a new firm coming in, you might want to also remove products to soften competition on the same products. And what we'll be studying here is, in a sense, how vertical interactions across firms will shape the product line. Now, there is a literature that studies vertical downstream interactions in mechanism design settings, Calzolari and Pavan and Dvorak. Usually the assumption in those papers is that the upstream firm has full control of the information available to the downstream firm. So what we will be incorporating here is this idea that the purchase history is always available. And also, these papers are about binary allocations. We're going to be looking at this in the Musa-Rosen setting, but the result that we have that the upstream firm will want to obfuscate, if possible, will completely obfuscate the data available to the downstream firm. This is similar. This is the main result in Calzolari and Pavan, and even though the environments informationally are different, the results are morally related, and I'm happy to give more details when we get to that slide. There's a very nice paper by Rossellana Argenziano and Alessandro Bonatti, where even though they are not doing mechanism design, they are studying this idea that there might be data linkages between firms, and these data linkages are the purchases of the consumers. And but they are not doing product line design, they are just doing pricing, but they are studying the same question about the availability of the purchase histories. And finally, there is a new set of papers studying flexible information design in the Musa-Rosen setting. So these are settings where the monopolist can design the information available to the consumers together with the product line. So in particular, Bergman, Heumann, and Morris are they also obtained that the best thing that the monopolies can do is to actually give the consumer coarse information and therefore provide a coarse product line. But even though both papers are driven by the idea that this helps soften rents, the mechanism is very different, because in those papers, the monopolies is endowed exogenously with the consumer's private information. Whereas here we're thinking that the way that the firm is learning about the consumer is a function of the product line that is available. Any questions or suggestions? I'm always in the lookout for good references that I might be missing. All right, so let me tell you a little bit, let me go over a little bit again through the model slide to add some things that I didn't say at the beginning. We're going to be assuming that the distribution from which types are drawn in the first period is going to have increasing virtual values. And the reason is that if we didn't have increasing virtual values, we will already have a pruned product line coming from Myerson ironing. And then it will be messy to distinguish what part of the pruning comes from ironing, what part of the pruning comes from the limited commitment friction. So we're going to just start from a complete product line setting. And then we're going to parameterize the probability that the consumer of type theta has value VH by the probability that the consumer's value is below theta, according to the prior distribution. And if I have time, I will tell you a little bit how we can relax the parametric assumptions. Now, why do we assume this? Because this will give us so let me backtrack for a second. Why do we assume this? There's a very classic result in the literature on behavior-based price discrimination that a firm that has commitment power, even if it could intertemporally price discriminate, it will choose not to do so. And the reason is that anticipating the ratchet effect and the rents that it has to pay the consumer, the firm chooses then not to price discriminate. But this result relies on perfectly persistent types. And it is well known when you have evolving types that this result might change. So this assumption that P of theta equals a probability that the consumer's type is below theta in the first period will restore for us the result that there will be no intertemporal price discrimination in the commitment solution in the case where we have gamma equals 1. So this is the role of that result, of that assumption. And the second assumption that we will make once we get to the limited commitment situation is that we're going to assume that the types are uniformly distributed, which in particular means that the probability that a consumer of type theta has value VH is linear in theta. And the reason to make this assumption is that, as you will see, characterizing the optimal product line under limited commitment will be an exercise in information design with a continuum of types. And most of the results in that setting are derived for the case in which the standard cares only about the posterior mean. And therefore, a lot of the assumptions that we're going to be making in the model are just so that when we get the objective function for the upstream firm in the limited commitment solution, it only depends on the posterior mean of theta. Any questions about this? All right. You can, if you have questions about, you can always ask retroactively also, if I'm going too quickly. Now, I promised that I was going to discuss a bit the form of the upstream profits. So the upstream profits are going to be a combination of the product line profits and some percentage of the downstream profits. And I mentioned that if you think that these are the same firms, it is natural to think that gamma equals 1, but you could think that gamma less than 1 means that the firm is running 2 operations and it has different weight on the profits of the different operations. But if you think that the upstream and downstream profits are different, firms are different, it is natural to take gamma equals 0, and then you might ask, why are we going to be carrying a non-zero gamma round, well, you could think that gamma, the gamma might represent a payment. So gamma times the downstream profits might represent a payment from the downstream firm to the upstream firm for the use of consumer data. So at some point, the firms decided that the downstream firm was going to have access to consumer data. And if you think about the range of prices at which this data could be sold, this goes from 0 to the maximum that the downstream firm might be willing to pay, which is the difference between its profits with data and its profits without data. And the profits without data don't depend on the mechanism, so we can delete them. And this will be, in that case, the objective function that the upstream firm will solve if gamma represented the bargaining power of the upstream firm vis-a-vis the downstream firm. Now, of course, this prompts the question of would the upstream, under that interpretation, would the upstream firm want to sell the data to begin with? So this exercise that we're doing in terms of what data the upstream firm will want to make available to the downstream firm is an answer to that question, and the result that the upstream firm wants to provide full privacy, no matter the value of gamma, means that there is no price actually at which it would like to sell the consumer data, any consumer data, to the downstream firm, not only the purchase history. So I'm going to go sort of quickly because it's just to make sure that we're all on the same page between first how upstream information is incorporated into the downstream mechanism, then how vertical integration internalizes informational externalities across periods, and how data intermediation benchmark works. And that will give us enough of a background to then understand what are the frictions that arise in the limited commitment setting. So I bet that everyone is familiar with this, but let me just show it for the sake of making it common knowledge. So in the second period, we know the consumer has value VH with probability P of theta, but the downstream firm might not know theta. It might have some belief about theta, and I'm going to call that belief F2. So basically, what is for the downstream firm the probability that the consumer is of value VH in the second period is the posterior mean of P of theta under the distribution F2. Now, once we have this and we have that the first period allocation is irrelevant, is payoff irrelevant for the in the second period, one can show that the optimal downstream mechanism will be a posted price. And this posted price depends on how large this posterior mean of P of theta is. So if the downstream firm does not think that it's very likely that the consumer's value is high, it will sell the good with probability 1 at a price of L. And if she's very convinced that the consumer's value is high, she will sell the good only to the high valuation consumer at a price of VH. And there will be some cutoff that we will see a lot throughout the talk, at which the downstream firm is indifferent between selling at VL and selling at VH. And basically, this cutoff comes from the second degree price discrimination intuition that you have a revenue of VL with probability 1 if you sell at VL, and some revenue with VH only with the probability that the consumer is of type VH. And you're trading, at this point, you're indifferent between those two. Now, this translates into how the consumer rents are determined. So the consumer will prefer, a consumer type theta prefers that the downstream firm is convinced that her value is low. Because in that case, whenever this should be P of theta, whenever her value is high, she gets some difference, some rents because she purchases the good at a price of L when her value is VH. She gets rent 0 when the downstream firm, is convinced that the consumer's value is sufficiently high. Either because she doesn't buy the good because the price is high, or she buys the good and her valuation is charged. Now, As you can imagine, because there will be like an information design problem behind all of this, it will be very important to know, or it will be a useful benchmark to know what the downstream firm will do if it didn't have any consumer data. So if you think about it, the upstream firm always has the option of choosing one product and all the consumers buying this product and therefore not transmitting any data to the downstream firm. And at that point, the downstream firm will have a posterior equal to the prior. So the prior mean of P of theta, given the assumption that P of theta is F1 of theta, this is a half. And therefore, what the optimal price is depends on whether a half is to the right or to the left of mu bar. So when a half is to the right of mu bar, then the optimal price absent any information is going to be VH. And instead of saying mu bar less than a half through the whole talk, I'm going to call that a premium downstream market for high willingness to pay. So if I say premium, it means that absent consumer data, the downstream firm wants to charge a price of VH. And when mu bar is, or when a half is to the left of mu bar, then the optimal price absent consumer data is VL. And I'm going to refer to that as a mass downstream market for low willingness to pay. Any questions about this? All right. So the vertical integration benchmark is an exercise in dynamic mechanism design. So when we're thinking that the upstream firm can choose in period one, both the product line and the downstream allocation. So it's going to basically choose a dynamic mechanism where the consumer first reports her type, and that determines a menu from which it chooses qualities and transfers. But also it will determine the menu that to which she will report her value in the second period. And this dynamic mechanism has to satisfy consumer upstream and downstream participation and truth-telling constraints. And importantly, in the dynamic mechanism, when the consumer is locking in the second period menu in period one, and that's what gives the scope for intertemporal price discrimination. So different thetas might lock in different menus in the second period. But what we're going to show is the following. We're going to show that under vertical integration, so when you internalize all informational externalities across periods, the firm will find it optimal to offer a complete product line, because once it is internalizing all informational externalities, it can decide the product line separate from the downstream allocation. And the downstream allocation will be such that when the consumer's value is high, she's going to be served with probability 1 regardless of theta. And when the consumer value is low, in the second period, she's only going to be served if her first period type is high enough. And what does this mean? It means that basically the firm is going to be giving discounts for buying quality sometimes. So in the case of so one way to think about it is airlines. If you buy a business ticket, you get champagne for free. If you buy an economy ticket, you get you can pay for champagne. So the idea is that the firm is trying to make the allocation of the low thetas less attractive to the high thetas, and it can do so by distorting quality in the first period, but also distorting the allocation probability in the second period. When gamma equals 1, as I mentioned, there will be no price discrimination. So the consumer will either be always served for both her values, or she will never be served. Or she will only be served where her value is high, regardless of her type. So just in pictures with the uniform distribution, so the product line, which is the first part in these brackets, does not depend on whether on the downstream allocation. So it's going to be the typical Musa-Rosen distortion where all the qualities are distorted downwards, and because we have the uniform, all the types below half don't get served. Now, when the downstream market is mass, so absent consumer information, the optimal price is VL. In fact, all the consumer types get served in the second period and get the lowest price. In the premium downstream market, when gamma is less than 1, we're going to get that in the low end, you can access the good for a high price, and then you have to pay a low price to access the good. But as gamma goes to 1, this threshold theta star moves to 1. And in that case, as I mentioned before, the assumption that P of theta equals F1 of theta gives us that there is no price discrimination. Either the price is always VL for all theta, or the price will always be VH for all theta. Any questions about this? All right. So the data intermediation situation is one in which the upstream firm now controls the product line and the downstream information, but it doesn't control the downstream mechanism. But we're assuming that the upstream firm is the only source of consumer information that the downstream firm has access to. So this is a special case of mechanism design with non-contractible actions. So you can think that what the mechanism is doing is takes a report from the consumer, gives them a given quality transfer, and then sends a message to the downstream firm. And the only content that this message has to have is whether the downstream firm should charge a price of VL or should charge a price of VH, because we know that this is the only two actions that the downstream firm will do, whatever information it is provided with. And of course, it has to be that the downstream firm finds the recommendation obedient. So it has to be that the recommendations to VL or VH are sent with the correct probability, so that whenever the downstream firm hears VL, she does base rule, given the mechanism, and finds it optimal to do VL. And in this case, what we are going to get is that the product line is the same as in Musa-Rosen, so the same complete product line as in vertical integration, but we're not going to get any price discrimination. So in the data intermediation situation, this idea of generating high prices for low types and low prices for high types, this can never be optimal for the downstream firm. And therefore, so the upstream firm sort of gives up in trying to induce that. And therefore, what we're going to get is that in a premium market, everyone faces a price of VH. And in a mass market, all consumer types face a price of VL. So the upstream firm is offering a full product line, but also full privacy to the consumer. So the upstream firm discloses no information to the downstream firm. And because we lose the quality discounts for data intermediation, we will lose them as well in the limited commitment solution. So this will be the benchmark against which we're going to build the limited commitment solution in a sense. Any questions about this? All right. So now we want to think about the case where the upstream firm controls both the design of the product line, perhaps of some downstream information, so it can always give more information to the downstream firm if it wanted, but the downstream firm always has access to the consumer's purchase history. So whatever information the upstream firm decides to provide on top of this is fine, but it can never remove from the downstream firm the observation of what allocation the consumer chooses from the mechanism. So just to get a sense of what the challenge is, we have to, given the upstream product line, we need that the consumer's choices out of the product line are consistent with the downstream prices. So suppose that the upstream firm offers the product line that I have in the picture, and then the consumer makes choices in a way, in this way, then the downstream firm will, because here we have that higher consumer types are buying higher quality, it's natural to think that prices will be low below a certain quality and will be high above a certain quality. But now it might be that if these are the prices, the consumer wants to deviate. So certain high types that are facing high prices, they would prefer to buy a lower quality and get low prices. But you might think that if once the consumer does this, the downstream firm understands and updates its pricing. So given the mechanism, there is this game between the consumer and the downstream firm. And on top of this, we have that the upstream firm is trying to choose a product line, understanding this equilibrium problem between the consumer and the downstream firm. So in a sense, we have two equilibrium problems here. One is the consumer vis-a-vis downstream pricing, and the other one is the upstream versus the downstream firm. Because once the upstream firm changes its product line, it changes the game between the consumer and downstream firm, and basically this will be feedback into the upstream and downstream choices. So basically what we're going to do with the results from our previous work is get rid of this first equilibrium problem and reduce everything to the equilibrium problem between the upstream firm and the downstream firm. So the model basically that we have here is a special case of the model for which we prove the revelation principle for limited commitment. And we show that without loss of generality, when we think about the upstream firm choosing mechanisms, we can restrict attention to mechanisms that we call direct Blackwell mechanisms. So these are mechanisms that are going to be direct. The consumer will report a type, and the mechanism then will do something. And why are they Blackwell? Because the way the mechanism works is, given the consumer type, the mechanism first determines a Blackwell experiment, a distribution or posteriors conditional on this consumer's type. And then, given the posterior that is outputted by the mechanism, then the mechanism determines the allocation for the consumer. And the mechanism will satisfy two kinds of constraints. There will be truth-telling and participation constraints on the part of the consumer. And then there will be a downstream sequential rationality constraint that basically keeps track that the beliefs that the mechanism suggests are actually the beliefs that the downstream firm will have conditional on observing that message. So as you can see, basically what this is doing is there's two goods in the economy now. The good of the variable quality, but also the information that is available to the consumer, and the mechanism is keeping track of both. And the direct Blackwell mechanism is basically encoding how the consumer information translates into downstream information and also into personalization. So basically the mechanism, given the belief, will determine the belief of the downstream firm will determine the product that the consumer gets. And therefore, the product line is as informative as the information provided downstream. Any questions about this? All right. So so far I haven't imposed the parametric assumptions, and I'll do that in 1 second. But before we do that, I think it's important to reflect on what drives the product line pruning. So having coarser product lines, but then also having product line gaps, because we could have product line pruning, so provide a subinterval of qualities, but we don't necessarily need for product line pruning to have these gaps that I showed you in the pictures, that will show in the optimal solution. So product line pruning, so we know from the data intermediation benchmark that the upstream firm in an ideal scenario would show nothing to the downstream firm. And therefore you could imagine that this alone already drives the desire of the upstream firm to shrink the product line. In particular, the way not to show anything to a downstream firm that always observes the purchase history is to offer one product to the consumer, hoping that all the consumers just get that product, and then the downstream firm will have no updating based on the purchase history. Now, the product line gaps here will arise for two reasons. One is just second-degree price discrimination, and I will show you this one when we go into the different cases. But also there is a sense in which now even though the mechanism that the firm will offer will satisfy truth-telling, the consumer's incentives to tell the truth are intertwined with what the downstream firm will do. And the upstream firm sometimes may not find it optimal to prevent price discrimination. It might be too costly to do this. And whenever there is price discrimination, then the consumer has to be somehow compensated for the rents that it's going to lose downstream. And instead of paying the consumer with money, the firm will pay the consumer with guaranteeing that consumers with sufficiently high types that are going to be price discriminated are going to get sufficiently high qualities. So just before imposing parametric assumptions, what we can show is that if you give me an incentive compatible mechanism, despite having this feedback between the consumer's upstream choices and downstream pricings that could invert single crossing, still we're going to get a single crossing sort of property where higher consumer types will get higher qualities, like in the picture that I showed you before, which means that then the downstream prices will be higher, the higher the quality purchased. But then at the moment where there is a change in pricing, there has to be a product line gap. So basically, the incentive compatibility by itself will introduce distortions to the product line, where the firm will pay the consumer with a sufficiently high range of qualities to compensate for the fact that the consumer will be treated differently in the second period. So the product line gap will be there to compensate the lost rents. All right, so now I'm going to show you how the optimal product line under limited commitment works. And here is where, in the background, I will impose all the parametric assumptions. So basically, the way we're going to proceed is we're going to set the revelation principle result allows us to set a constraint optimization program to characterize a firm's optimal mechanism. And then we're going to, the incentive constraints and everything will give us what people typically in mechanism design call the virtual surplus. Under the parametric assumptions, this virtual surplus will depend only on the posterior mean. And for now, what we're going to do is we're going to follow a first order approach. We're going to ignore the monotonicity constraint. We're going to solve the maximization of the virtual surplus without the monotonicity constraint. And then we're going to check when the monotonicity constraint is satisfied. So basically, this is what we are doing in the background, and I'm going to, because of the time of the seminar, I'm going to obviate all the formulas. I'm happy to show the formulas with the caveat that it might not be the right time of the day to see that many formulas. So the optimal product line will depend on two key parameters. One is what the downstream firm would do without information, and that was our parameter mu bar. And the other one is how much the upstream firm cares about downstream profits. So the first parameter basically will determine which products are going to be offered. So in a sense, what we're going to see in the next couple of slides is that the products that the upstream firm chooses are going to send the right message about the consumer's willingness to pay to the downstream firm. And the gamma parameter, basically what we'll be indexing is how willing the upstream firm is to share consumer data with the downstream firm. So the more the upstream firm cares about downstream profits, at some point it will become willing to share this information with the downstream firm, because the downstream firm has a single agent decision problem to solve, and we know that information is valuable. And this is what I said before, that we will be basically solving a relaxed program and then checking when it satisfies monotonicity. And I can tell you there's one case where we will fail to satisfy monotonicity, and I will show you what's missing. And in the paper, we have like some pictures of a function of parameters of when the solution to a relaxed program is implementable. So let's start by thinking first about the case where the downstream market is premium. So if we didn't give any information to the downstream firm, it will choose to set a high price. And actually, this is the price that the upstream firm will try to implement if it could control all information that the downstream firm has available. So remember that in the first best and in the second best, we get complete product lines. In the limited commitment solution, what we're going to get is that the upstream firm will remove the lower quality products, and it will remove enough lower quality products that when the downstream firm sees that the consumer bought the lowest quality product, it convinces itself that the consumer's type is high enough so that it is indifferent between pricing at VL or VH, and it will set a high price. So basically, we will lose the bottom part of the product line. We will only offer a high-end product line, and everything will be priced at VH. So the joke that I always make is that here what the upstream firm is doing is it's selling like very expensive watches. And the fact that you didn't buy a very expensive watch doesn't mean you're a cheapskate. It just means that it's very, very expensive. So basically, the firm kills all the bottom of the product line, offers a sufficiently high-end product line that conveys that when a consumer purchases from it, their type is high. But if you don't purchase from the high-end product line, that doesn't mean that you don't value quality. It means that prices are very high. Now, from here, you can see that this will be an instance in which limited commitment will be detrimental, not only to upstream profits, but also to consumer welfare. So one way to see this is if we start from the data intermediation solution, prices in the second period are the same. So the downstream firm is charging VH no matter what the consumer buys. But some consumer types are going to get lower quality in the first period relative to the data intermediation solution. And the types that are getting the same quality as in the second best, they are actually facing higher prices, because the extra downward distortion in the quality means that the upstream firm can charge higher prices for all the remaining qualities that it sells. And despite it being able to charge higher prices for what remains of the product line, we know that the upstream firm is hurt because it's not implementing the data intermediation solution. So in a sense, type by type, the consumer is worse off, and the upstream firm is also worse off. So this is a situation where limited commitment, or in this case, availability of the purchase histories to the downstream firm, basically shrinks the upstream pie. Now, when we go into the mass downstream market, things are going to get more interesting. So in a mass downstream market, the outside option price, to call it some way, is a price of VL. So everyone should be served. And the optimal product line will depend on how much the upstream firm cares about the downstream interaction. So when gamma is very low, think about gamma equals 0. Basically, the downstream firm is just an externality to the upstream firm. And whenever the upstream firm allows for price discrimination, it has to compensate the consumer for their lost rents, but it gains nothing from the rents that are extracted downstream. So when gamma is low, what we will see is that the upstream firm will choose a product line so that there is no price discrimination because it cannot benefit from any of the rent extraction of the consumer downstream, and it's hurt by the rents that it has to leave upstream. So what it will do is, it depends on Mubar, but it will now produce what we call a mass product line. So it can either fully prune the product line and only offer a mid-tier product, or as Mubar increases, it will offer a two-tier product line where we have only the bottom of the product line offered and then an upgrade. And here there will be no price discrimination. So all the products are going to be charged at VL. And this gap is not because of price discrimination. Sorry, it's not because of rents to the consumer. It will come from the incentives of the upstream firm to engage in second-degree price discrimination. And this is a case where actually limited commitment or the availability of the purchase histories actually can benefit the consumer. So in this case, there's consumers that are getting higher qualities than in the second best. And there's consumers that even though their quality is distorted downwards, they face lower prices. And they have to face lower prices because some consumers are getting higher quality than before. And then the mix between upward distortions in quality and lower prices for the high type consumers means that we can get that welfare is higher, either on average under limited commitment or even type by type. So this is what this slide says, which means that if you think about the data intermediation solution, when the consumer is offered full privacy, this is actually hurting the consumer relative to the limited commitment solution. So full privacy here works to help always the upstream firm, but it sometimes goes against the consumer's interests. And I have, I think, 1 minute, so let me show what happens in the last case, and then we can discuss after the talk. So as gamma increases, the upstream firm starts becoming more and more concerned with downstream profits. And this is a reflection that actually price discrimination is nothing but the observation that with more information, the downstream firm makes better choices. And when is the downstream firm making the biggest mistake when setting a price of VL for the high theta consumers? So the upstream firm will decide to share the information about the high theta consumers to the downstream firm. And once she shares this information, the downstream firm will price discriminate these consumers. She will set a high price. And then, given that they're going to be price discriminated, the upstream firm will not distort their quality beyond the second best distortion, because there's no point in introducing further distortions once they are going to be price discriminated. So there's no point in obfuscating their quality if they're already going to be price discriminated. So this is where we're going to get the three-tier product line that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, where a bunch of the lower bottom of the product line is going to get a price of VL, and and this first gap is going to be, again, because of second-degree price discrimination. Then the upper part is going to get a price of VH. So this gap is going to be because of compensating for missed rents. And basically, this is where the monotonicity constraint might fail. So we're only putting, in the relax program, we're only putting the downward-looking incentive constraints, and we're already getting a gap. But we don't get necessarily a gap that's big enough sometimes to capture all the constraints that we're missing. So this is the case where we might lose implementation. And if someone has suggestions of how to incorporate the monotonicity constraint, that's also something that we're always looking for. So let me get to the conclusion slide. So basically, the paper is trying to provide a model where there's a trade-off between better match value and price discrimination. Most models of price discrimination don't have this option of sorting into different products. I want to highlight the effect that the endogeneity of the purchase histories has when we're thinking about the costs and benefits of making data available about the consumers. And with that, I'm out of time, so I will just say thank you. And if there's any remaining questions, I'm happy to.
Thank you for the presentation, Laura. I have two questions. I wait till the end. I'm making some of one is about it's outside your model. One is about the upstream firm, and maybe you have considered, it's not in your model, maybe you have considered outside your model, the benefits of a small portfolio. Of course, if you have a good portfolio, a broad portfolio and production costs, you have a lot of costs and portfolio costs, and the tendency is more for standardization for the upstream firm to reduce production costs, to my opinion, and to scale, to have maximum scale and to reduce the cost. Have you considered maybe outside your model that the upstream firm has an incentive to have a short and narrow portfolio and not a broad portfolio? Independent from the consumer choice.
No, to be honest, we haven't. There is one thing that you might be pointing out is like contrary to, I think that contrary to, for instance, marketing or operations research literature, when they're thinking about product lines and they're thinking about the cost of holding the product line together, like Musa Rosen, even though it has its product line interpretation, it's a model where the good is not produced until the consumer says that they want the particular good. So you're not holding, so you're not producing the good until it's until the consumer says this is a good that they want.
Yeah. Okay. And in some point,
but it's a good question.
Yeah, and in one point you give an answer in your model. Of course, the compensation through the upstream payoff, the share of the downstream payoff, could be some point of compensation for the upstream company to hold a broad portfolio. Maybe could be. And a second question regarding vertical interaction and data intermediation. You mentioned it in your model, of course, perfectly, but in practice you see, and maybe you see it in your literature, the upstream companies try to bypass the downstream companies to get consumer information. For instance, in the practice, you see loyalty cards, loyalty programs from the producer of the product, not from the retailer. You see the producer because they want personalized data from the consumer to optimize the thing. Do you have? Of course, you mentioned it, but do you know this programs and loyalty cards from the upstream company to get data and to bypass the downstream company if it's not the same company?
I see. So I think that that will also be outside our model, because if I understand correctly what you're describing, it's a setting where in a sense, the upstream firm is now selling directly to the downstream firm, and the downstream firm is the one that then sets prices for the consumer.
Yes.
And therefore, the only way that the upstream firm has access to consumer data is through the downstream firm. And we haven't considered that interaction, but I do know what you're referring to in terms of like the loyalty programs. But I think that because of the direction of the availability of information in our model is different, we don't get that. Yeah. But it's another thing that we could definitely look into.
If you look on an abstract level, I think the principle is the same. If the downstream firm is the only possibility to get the data from the end consumer, so the loyalty program, for instance, Adidas is a company who produces shoes, who have no access to personalized data without the retailer. A retailer could be Sports Direct or other shoe retailers. But Adidas has a loyalty program to get directly information throughout the downstream firm from his consumer, from his buyer, to optimize price discrimination or product portfolio or whatever. But in abstract, it's the same. If you have access to the downstream firm or launch a loyalty program, which is, of course, linked with costs, a lot of cost for example, Adidas. In principle, the model could be the same. It's a question of optimization. Is it the benefit for the upstream firm to bypass the downstream firm to get price information?
Yes.
That's just a remark. That's not just
no. That's no, but that's a very actually. Thank you very much for that point, because it's a. I think that in a sense we're ruling that out by assumption, by how the interaction is set up. But I agree that maybe it's just by tweaking a little bit the interaction, we could use the model also to look at that question. And okay. I think it's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.